nutrition in honeybees and humans. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, thank you. Right. Thank you very much, Mariel and Emma, and the Welsh Beekeepers Association for really supporting and organizing all the aspects of this webinar. Webinars are much more difficult for conventional speakers such as myself, because what I really like about giving talks to fellow beekeepers is I like meeting them and talking about the different aspects of beekeeping that people are interested in. Having a webinar is very much a one-way broadcasting of information, whereas I feel that in a lecture we're having a dialogue and I know what people are thinking when I'm talking to them. So you'll have to bear with me if my presentation is much more labored than it might otherwise be using the webinar. Let's come out. To begin with, I'd just like to remember all the people that we've lost in the year 2020. And I've just put in this little note with a reference to the wonderful poem by Stephen Spender. I think continually of those who were truly great. This is because I had one person in my mind in particular, and that was Dinah Sweet, who died in 2020. Dinah was one of my students at the Bee Research Unit many years ago at the University of Cardiff, and she will be sorely missed. She did so much for the Cardiff beekeepers and for the Welsh Beekeepers Association. She did a huge amount for the British Beekeepers Association, and she supported beekeepers across the world. Even of course in the Caribbean, where she used to work for quite a while with her husband John. And there is no doubt in my own mind that every time I go to a beekeeping meeting in the future, I'll still be looking for Dinah, because she was so enthusiastic, so generous, and such a remarkable person. If we look at nutrition, we're looking at something that's absolutely fundamental in biology. Nutrition studies the way in which organisms obtain the atoms that they need to build their bodies, and how they obtain the energy that they need to activate those atoms in the way that their genetic code requires them to do. So it's absolutely fundamental in biology. If we take a step back, the picture that you're looking at is the sort of view that you would have if you headed out from the planet Earth 2.5 million years at the speed of light. And if you then turned round and looked back at the planet Earth, this is what you would see. You would see an image like this, which would be the image of the Milky Way. And 5 billion years ago, a large star exploded at this position on the galactic disk. And you have to remember that at this point, 5 billion years ago, before the star exploded, there was just a large star, a sun, and no planets around it. When the star exploded, an amazing thing happens. The energy particularizes and forms little items that we call quarks, and the quarks stick together to form atomic nuclei. So all the atoms that have been used in our solar system to build honeybees and human beings have actually come from that explosion 5 billion years ago, and they haven't been made again since. So we have a situation where all the atoms have to be recycled. No new ones can be made. Sometimes people think that the atoms were made at the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, but that's not true. Only hydrogen, helium, and some of the small atoms were produced in the Big Bang. You see the speed of light's 186,000 miles a second. So this really does illustrate how huge the universe is that we are a part of. This is one of my really most nostalgic photographs from the time when I was a student at the University of Leeds, and it would be about 1969. And I'm at Down House in this photograph, where Charles Darwin spent the latter half of his life. The chair I'm sitting in is the chair in which Darwin actually wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And the stick I'm holding is Darwin's walking stick. And I was very privileged at that time to be able to go through lots of Darwin's papers and look into his private life, which is really quite amazing, and I would recommend to anyone. But it was Darwin that reminded us that it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the ones that can best adapt to change. Even Darwin didn't recognize at the time, this would be about, 1859, he didn't recognize that the dominant form of life on the planet Earth is the bacterium, and no other forms of life can survive without bacterial support. And we'll see that straight away when we look at how energy is provided in nutrition. The green plants are responsible for capturing sunlight energy from the sun, radiated out, and they can't do that without using a symbiotic bacterium, which is enclosed in their cells, which we call a chloroplast. This bacterium has its own genetic code, not the same code, of course, as the plant that it is serving in green plant photosynthesis. So here you've got light coming in, you've got carbon dioxide and water, and the chloroplast is fixing the energy into a glucose molecule, and it's producing oxygen. So here is the glucose molecule, which is one of those miraculous molecules that we have in biology that's essential for energy production in biological systems for so many different species, and particularly for honeybees and human beings. What you notice here is that the glucose molecule contains a lot of hydrogen atoms, and these are the key to energy production. Once you've locked the energy into the glucose molecule with a bacterium, you need another bacterium to get the energy out again in large quantities. And so animals, green plants, fungi, many other different arrangements of organic tissue have also formed symbiotic relationships with bacteria. And the one I'm thinking of now, of course, is the mitochondrion bacterium. The mitochondrion is found in virtually all the cells in a honeybee's body and virtually all the cells in a human body. And it contains its own nucleic code, its own DNA code, and it replicates by binary fission. When a woman produces an ovum or a queen honeybee produces an ovum, they put their species DNA into the nucleus, but into the cytoplasm, they inoculate their future offspring with these mitochondrial bacteria. None of them will come from the sperm. So this is entirely a female contribution to the next generation. What the mother is doing when she inoculates her ova with mitochondrial bacteria is she's supplying her offspring with batteries. And you can see here that coenzymes will collect the hydrogens from the glucose molecule and transport them to the mitochondrion. At the mitochondrion, an amazingly simple reaction completes a very complicated process. And you'll see oxygen is coming into the mitochondrion. This is the oxygen that the honeybee has breathed in through the trachea, and it's the same oxygen that a human being will breathe in through their lungs. It's transported through the liquids of the body to the mitochondrion, and on the mitochondrion, it is fused with the hydrogens that have been collected from the glucose molecule to produce a byproduct of metabolic wartime. At the same time as that process comes to an end, the energy that was related to this glucose molecule now becomes fixed in a carrying molecule, adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which can travel anywhere in the body to deliver energy where it's needed for a chemical reaction. This dependency on bacteria is something that people take for granted. And at every stage in nutrition, you see the involvement of microorganisms such as these. Here is a mitochondria looked at in the electron microscope, where we can see it in great detail. And this reaction that locks up the energy from sunlight into ATP is taking place on these long membranes here that are called cristae. So you can just imagine the oxygen coming in from the lymph if it's a human being, or from the hemocoel if it's a honeybee, and working along here and then meeting a coenzyme that is carrying hydrogen from the glucose molecule. A lot of these enzymes require iron to build them. And so it's not surprising that when teenage girls cut lean red meat out of their diet in an effort to avoid putting on weight, they do risk the problem of becoming subclinically deficient in iron, and therefore, of course, subclinically anemic. So it's not just the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood that is determined by the iron in the diet. It's also the final production of energy that takes place in the mitochondria. If we look at energy balance in humans, it's quite easy to see why people put on weight, because we live in a society where you can get an awful lot of energy without doing much work. All these portions of food on the left-hand side here will bring into the body 100 kilocalories of energy. So you can either have 2 teaspoonfuls of fat, 2 squares of chocolate, or you can have 3 carrots down at the bottom here, and they'll all deliver to the human body 100 kilocalories of energy. But if you want to get rid of that energy and not store it in subcutaneous fat, you've got to mountain bike for at least 13 minutes or swim for 19 minutes. The good news is you can sleep for 91 minutes, but you will eventually run out of time to sleep. You also use quite a lot of energy here, 39 minutes to get rid of 100 kilocalories just watching TV. And so, of course, people will put on weight if you put them in an environment where they bring into their body far more energy than they actually need. And if that balance is not equal, then, of course, if there's surplus energy, it will be stored as subcutaneous fat. And that is a problem for all of us in this modern society. The other interesting thing about nutrition in honeybees and humans is that we are both very conscious at time. In every cell in a honeybee's body and in every cell in a human body, there is a biological clock. And the biological clock is linking biochemical events in the body to time sequences. And in the brains of honeybees and the brains of human beings, there is a master clock which is synchronized with the external environment. And that continuously sends out signals to all the cells in the honeybee body and the human body, instructing them about the nature of a particular chemical reaction at a particular point in time. This is really very interesting because here at this experiment at Oxford University, people have been given an identical meal, but they've been given it at 3 different times of day. If they're given it at about 8 o'clock in the morning, so it's acting like a breakfast, 15% of the meal will be stored as subcutaneous fat. And Keith Frayne did this experiment by feeding the meals, and then he had tubes connected to the arteries and veins of the volunteers that measured the fat being produced and laid down actually in the fat body in the abdomen. So this is extremely reliable and well calculated information. When the same meal was given at lunchtime, 35% was stored as fat. But when the same meal was given as an evening meal at 6 o'clock at night, nearly 50% of the same meal was stored as subcutaneous fat. So clearly, if you're trying to manage your weight, it's important to have your main meal in the breakfast, a smaller meal at lunchtime, and a very much smaller meal at dinner. Because what's happening here is the brain is preparing the body to use the food that it gets in the breakfast, so it doesn't have to waste time breaking down its fat reserves. Whereas at nighttime, the brain is anticipating sleep and no demand for energy, so it's immediately transferring a lot of the energy into the chemistry that will store it as fat. Well, luckily, we've got our political leaders to set a good example in our environment. And here we see George Bush looking through some binoculars, but he doesn't tell us that he's forgotten to take the covers off the binoculars and he can't see anything, because that's not what people do in politics. They don't do the simple thing and say, oh, I can't see. They carry on talking. And this is a very good illustration of the fact that politics is the art of government. It's not the science of government. And we really do need more scientists in our legislature than we have at the present time. People who will respect the evidence and respect the truth and draw up policies which are related to truth. Over the last year in 2020, truth has been a huge casualty of the emergencies that we've had, both here and across the world. If we look at the honeybee anatomy, here I've colored up the gut. Here's the pharynx and the esophagus. And of course, digestive enzymes are produced right at the entry of the food into the pharynx. The hypopharyngeal gland, which lays on top of the head here and feeds down into a duct that comes in just underneath the pharynx. This hypopharyngeal gland in an older bee produces invertase, so it begins the digestion of carbohydrates as soon as sucrose, for example, enters the pharynx. The sucrose is going to be split into glucose and fructose. If you think about the human alimentary tract, as soon as we put food in our mouth, from our own salivary glands, we release amylase, and that begins also the digestion of carbohydrates in our mouth. And we start to break starch into smaller pieces, and you'll sometimes detect that sweetness as the starch begins to be broken up. The food then moves into the esophagus in a honeybee and down to the crop. When it reaches the crop, it's held up by a valve here, which is the proventricular valve. And looking down on this valve, you see 4 triangular shapes. And it's rather like looking down on the surface of a barnacle, because this valve sweeps through the contents of the crop, collecting particulate matter like dust or pollen grains and draws them into the ventriculus, the stomach of the bee here. And of course, if the bee is making honey, after the proventricular valve has cleaned the nectar, then the bee will regurgitate it back up onto the tongue and will flap its tongue to drive some of the water vapor off it to increase the concentration of the nectar down to as much as only 17% water at the end of the day for a good quality honey. The pollen and some honey if it's needed for energy, but certainly the pollen will travel then through the ventriculus and it will come to this point where it meets the hindgut. And in a larval honeybee, the midgut is not connected to the hindgut until the last larval instar. That stops the larva defecating on its own food, and it's a really important adaptation. The honeybees only have it because their ancestor was a parasitic wasp. And the parasitic wasp had this modification in its own larvae so that when it injected an egg into a caterpillar, the larva started to grow. But because the midgut wasn't connected to the hindgut, the larva couldn't kill the caterpillar by defecating inside it. So the larva accumulates all its waste material during its development in the cell. And then just before it pupates, the midgut connects to the hindgut, and then all the feces that have accumulated in the larva's body are expelled. The pupa then spins a cocoon to enclose itself while it completes its metamorphosis, and that cocoon effectively seals in the fecal material and any disease organisms that are present, and thereby protects the next generation. It's incredibly elegant as a system. These blue tubules here are, of course, Malpighian tubules, and they perform the same function as our kidneys. In this case, they're taking nitrogenous excretory products from the hemocoel and feeding them through to the gut and dumping them in the gut. Whereas, of course, our kidney does a similar thing. The blood flows through the glomerulus and is filtered. The liquid in the kidney tubule then passes down to the bladder, but as it passes through the kidney, anything the body wants is taken back out of the liquid. So the final urine that ends up in the bladder is just excretory material that the body was not programmed to identify. And then we come down to the rectum and out. The atomic composition of human beings has been worked out to the nth degree. We know the numbers of atoms in every tissue in the human body and in every organ in the human body. As always, you can see that hydrogen is the most dominant atom, and it's the same in honeybees and humans. Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen are the most abundant atoms in the human body. And there are 42 elements represented here. Some of them are really interesting. One, iron and zinc are particularly interesting. Iron, because we've already demonstrated that it's essential to have the right iron in the body if you're going to have the energy that you need to fulfill your genetic code. Zinc is important in immunology. It's important in COVID-19 because zinc will inhibit some of the reproductive processes of the RNA that has been injected into a cell's nucleus by the COVID virus. It's not really been injected, it's been transported into the nucleus from the breaking up virus in the cytoplasm. But zinc is a very useful aid to the immune system. Vitamin D is also helpful, and selenium is also helpful in the COVID crisis because selenium, we make 26 proteins that are dependent upon the presence of selenium, and it's a very powerful antioxidant and certainly is very helpful to the immune system. The iodine, the magnesium, potassium, and calcium also get into low supply in some groups of people in the British population. So here we've got these atoms in the wild environment. And as I said, they've only been produced once in the last 5 billion years. So they all have to be circulated round and round and recycled for honeybees and human beings to be able to use them. Even nitrogen, where we have 4/5 of the Earth's atmosphere is composed of nitrogen, but it's not available to human beings or to honeybees until bacteria in the soil have fixed it and oxidized it and turned it into nitrate, which is water soluble. Only then can the plants draw the nitrate up and convert the nitrate into amino acids and then build proteins. So even something that appears to be as common as nitrogen has to be recycled, and it needs bacterial involvement to do the job properly. Of course, what is recycling all these atoms are the different species. And this is why biodiversity is so important for environmental stability. The less species you have, the harder it is for the atoms that are required in nutrition to be recycled. And here's the honeybee playing a hugely important part in helping a wide range of species of plants to prosper. And of course, lots of other animals will depend upon those plants. For example, like cows and sheep on clover. We will have the cows and the sheep here as principal foods for human beings. There's the sheep in the uplands, and we've got cows in the meadowlands, and we've got pigs in the woodlands. These animals are the richest source of nutrients for human beings. When you eat a part of these animals, you digest every single structure that is placed in the gut. And in fact, our ancient ancestors were completely carnivorous. But over the last 7 million years, we've included more and more vegetable material in our diet progressively. All these mammalian species, of course, share 80% of their genes with human beings. So it's not surprising that most of the things that they make are required by human beings. So just to remind us of that. So if you're just choosing a food for maximum nutritional value, you can't beat a red meat animal, a mammal like ourselves. And of course, second to that would come cow's milk. There are equivalent creatures that, such as shrimps and various marine animals that can also slot in here. And also, of course, fish are particularly good at supplying the requirements. But red meat, largely because its availability of iron is a key component in the human diet. Interestingly, honeybees share 60% of their genes with humans because, of course, we had a common ancestor, which was a segmented bilaterally symmetrical worm. And therefore, all the basic processes are shared with humans. And even the gene that creates the circadian clock in the brain, which we call the period gene, is the same in honeybees as it is in humans. The fact that honeybees share 60% of their genes with us has led to a very unexpected development. This is a paper that was published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2016, and it compares the nutritional value of beef, chicken, pork, and honeybees to human beings. Of course, what's happening with the honeybee section is that honeybee larvae are being killed with carbon dioxide, which will just put them to sleep painlessly. They are then being dried and powdered. And you can see in this comparison of United Nations nutrient value scores that the honeybee larvae in powdered form outscore these three major producers of nutrients for human beings. And it may well be that insects will become a major source of nutrients as the world population of human beings continues to increase. And we find it harder and harder to get sufficient nutrients to put into the food supply. So this may be, ironically, another product that honeybees will produce, beekeepers will produce in the future, powdered honeybee as an absolutely essential food source from about 2050 onwards. If you look at the relationship between health and the intake of additional nutrients, if you read newspapers, you often get the impression that if a certain quantity of a nutrient does you good, then 10 times the quantity will do you 10 times as good. And this is totally not the case. This is the true case. A little bit of everything gives you the maximum health benefit. And then as you increase the quantity of a nutrient, particularly the micronutrients, the benefit starts to fall. And then you get no benefit, and then it actually starts to kill you. This graph is true for oxygen, and it's also true for water. So it's quite different to what people think when they read magazine articles about diet and health. One of the world's great authorities in nutrition, Elsie Widdowson, who incidentally was the sister of the beekeeper Eva Crane. Elsie Widdowson said to me once, "You eat a little bit of everything and not too much of any one thing. And that's the best way to stay fit and healthy." And Elsie was the pioneer of nutrition science. She helped to design the wartime diet during the Second World War. She was an amazing person. It was Jean-Marie Savarin who actually coined the phrase "Dites-moi ce que vous mangez, je vous dirai ce que vous êtes." Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are. And nothing could be truer as a statement, because even the expression of the genes can be modified by the food that a person eats or a honeybee eats. That's demonstrated particularly clearly in honeybees, because a worker bee has the same genome as a queen. But the expression of the genome is modified by the food that is fed to the larvae. And by modifying the gene expression, the creature that is produced is totally different, both structurally and behaviorally, and there's a totally big difference in life expectancy. It's amazing that the same genome can be modified by the food supply to produce totally different organisms. We can work out exactly what every person requires nutritionally according to their age, their gender, their ethnicity, and even their occupation. So here I've been giving an example of an 8-year-old girl, and here's the fluid, energy, fiber, and phytonutrients, the carbohydrates, fat, and protein that she will require. These are daily quantities. Here we've got the atoms, the elements, the minerals, and then here we've got the vitamins. And we can mark on this table the nutrients that are of particular concern in the British diet at the present time. So everything marked in red there has a story to tell about some particular group having difficulty. The fiber is extremely important because without it, the gut can't function properly. It's one of the reasons why we don't have an enzyme that can digest cellulose, which is what a natural vegetarian animal would have, a means of digesting cellulose, because that's such a principal component of plants. We don't have that, but it's very important that we don't have that because it helps our gut to function properly. The long-chain omega-3 fatty acids are extremely important. If you have these around the heart and you're about to have a heart attack, the long-chain omega-3 fats will resist the heart attack. And if you have the heart attack, you will recover much more quickly if you have long-chain omega-3 fatty acids around the heart. These long-chain omega-3s have 5 or 6 double bonds in the fatty acid chain, and that makes them very springy. So the liquidity of the membrane is improved, and it works so much better than if it's just packed with saturated fat. And then lastly, we just need to mention the amino acids. The amino acid supply is extremely important, and these are the limiting amino acids, which again are the same for honeybees and for human beings. And the key one here is lysine. Also with honeybees, isoleucine could be added to this list. But these are the amino acids that you really do have to have in your diet. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if you've got all the others, because these will limit the rate at which you can synthesize proteins. It's really interesting when you look in a honey at the non-sugar solution, which is only 4% of a honey. Just look at the range of amino acids that are present, the enzymes, the range of minerals, the organic acids, and the vitamins. You've got riboflavin, vitamin B2, which is one of the coenzymes is produced from this that carries hydrogen from the glucose molecule to the mitochondrion. Niacin produces another coenzyme, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, which carries hydrogens to the mitochondrion. So even in the small quantity of honey that is not composed of sugars, you have a fantastic range of nutrients. And you only need small quantities of these nutrients to fulfill their major provision of good health. In a balanced diet, 2/3 of the food in humans would come from plant material, and 1/3 would come from animal material. If you wanted to lose weight, then you increase the number of leaves, stems, and flowers at the expense of the starchy foods, because starch is just pure glucose. So potatoes, cereals, bread, and pasta are reduced. And it's quite an interesting point here. Fruits are always grouped with these vegetables, but fruits are a deception perpetrated on animals by plants. The fruit is designed by the plant to be eaten by an animal so that the animal will disperse the seeds in the fruit away from the parent plant. So just before a fruit ripens, the plant pulls back all its nutrients. It doesn't want to give them away, and it pulls them back into the leaves and the stems. And it just leaves a little bit of sugar in the fruits to keep the animals coming back and eating more. So you have to be wary of eating too much fruit at the expense of not eating enough leaves and stems, because it's the leaves and the stems of the plants that contain the nutrients and the fiber that you will want in your diet. Now, of course, fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, the honeybees have to get from pollen. They're getting their energy-based food, the nectar, from the flowers, but it's in the pollen that you really need to look if you want to ensure that your bees are properly fed. And you'll see here in these different pollen loads that these bees in this colony are going to many different floral sources. The same rule applies in honeybee nutrition as applies in human nutrition. A little bit of everything, not too much of any one thing. The greater the variety of pollen that you see coming into a honeybee, which you can test by putting a little pollen trap on the front of the hive, the greater the variety coming in, the more likely the colony is to be healthy. And if a colony is deprived of pollen, the hypopharyngeal glands don't develop properly in the young bee, and they can't feed the brood properly. Here we've got a typical British honey, and straight away you can see dandelion pollen grains, which are very obvious here, and pollen grains that look like clover, white clover here. But then you've got these large pollen grains, which are the pollen grains of pine, and they've got these air sacs on them because pine is wind pollinated and not pollinated by insects. So straight away you can see that these bees have got another food resource. They're not just collecting nectar from flowers, they're collecting honeydew. And honeydew, of course, is the exudate from sap-sucking insects such as aphids and it's extremely rich in a whole range of nutrients, particularly amino acids. And when honeybees make a honey that is being derived from floral nectar and from honeydew, the amino acid content in the honey is much, much higher than it would be if the honey was derived solely from flowers. So this improves the nutritional value of a honey. And just to confirm that there's honeydew present, we can see little bits of algal cells or little bits of fungi or fungal spores which have stuck to the honeydew on a leaf of a rose or a lime tree, and the bees have collected that. So that's quite interesting. It's an important resource for honeybees that we tend not to recognize. There is a dandelion pollen grain close up. The bees release enzymes in the ventriculus which enter these pores, and they leach out all the nutritional contents, leaving the pollen grain intact. This means that the pollen grain then becomes non-digestible fiber for the honeybee gut and helps the honeybee gut to work. An important thing to recognize in nutrition is that the cavity between the mouth and the anus, whether you're a honeybee or a human being, is not part of the organism. It's part of the environment. And what we've done in our evolution is we've enclosed a part of the environment by our alimentary tract so that we can better control the digestive enzymes and the absorption of nutrients. This is why so many microorganisms can live inside the guts of honeybees and human beings. We have more than 400 species of microorganisms living in our colon, and they are doing all sorts of little chemical processes that we can benefit from. One of the reasons I always support the drinking of milk as part of a healthy, balanced diet is that milk provides lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, which are really good organisms to get into the gut because they deny space and growing capability for bacteria that you might not particularly want to have in your gut. Recently, we found that the gut biome, which is what the name is used to describe this population of microbes, the gut biome in the honeybee gut seems to have played some role in the identification of bees from a particular colony. So there is some kin recognition factor being present because of the organisms that the bees are sharing in their guts as they exchange food within the colony. And we're expecting to see some interesting papers on that subject coming out in the near future. In human beings, looking after your bacteria in your gut is an important part of keeping healthy. Here we get the range of pollen grains that you'd expect to see in a good honey. This is the sort of pollen grain that you might see on rosebay willow herb, Epilobium angustifolium. This one is actually from Enothera, the evening primrose. You've got Ipomoea here, the morning glory. You've got Sildalcia, the hollyhocks. You've got here Ricinus, the castor oil plant. Here's Helianthus, the sunflower. And this reticulated, beaded reticulum here is from a lily pollen grain. These have been artificially colored, of course, to show the different species. In the actual scanning electron micrographs, they wouldn't be colored. And we can name those. And I would really recommend anyone who is interested in pollen grains and honeybee nutrition to make their own studies of their own bees and see how they benefit from some pollen being present, but not from some others. Some plants, of course, can produce pollen that is poisonous to bees, and some plants can produce nectar that is poisonous to bees. And researchers all over the world are gradually collecting these into little lists, but luckily they're not too common. Plants that are poisonous to bees are not too common in the United Kingdom. And where they do exist, the bees tend not to go to them for various reasons. Bees also collect propolis, and here you can see a bee with propolis on the pads, the baskets on the hind legs, and this contains flavonoids, which are very important phytonutrients. And again, it illustrates that honeybees are always collecting more things than one thinks of when you just think of nectar and pollen. Nosema is a really important problem for beekeepers, because if nosema gets into a colony, particularly when it's squashed in a feeder, then it can have dire consequences. This is a photograph I took in Japan many years ago, and it shows Japanese beekeepers feeding their bees. And to avoid bees getting crushed in the feeder, this is an actual woven bag containing the feeding solution. And then a strip of foam is put on top before it's brought to the hive, to make sure that no bees can actually get in and die. Because an adult bee that's suffering from nosema will be carrying 12 million spores. That means that if just one bee carrying 12 million spores is crushed, either around the box or into the feeder, then of course the whole colony is going to be in a state of disaster very quickly. This method of feeding is very good for reducing contamination, because the liquid just weeps through the weft on this side of the bag. If you look at the ventriculus of a honeybee that's suffering from nosema, you see the cells are being completely destroyed, so the bee is starving to death. These are the parasite Nosema apis multiplying. You only need to get one spore in one cell and it will multiply 100 times. So very quickly, the whole of the lining of the gut is destroyed by this parasite. So nosema is a very important disease of bees, and it not only starves the bees, it lets in viruses and other disease organisms. So it's very important not to ignore the presence of nosema, and be particularly careful not to crush bees if you have nosema in a colony. Well, I mentioned the circadian clock, so it's worth just pointing out where it is in the human brain. I know this brain very well because it's my own brain. I've never understood people owning a car and never looking underneath the bonnet to see how it's working. And the circadian clock is positioned here at about 22,000 nerve cells near the optic chiasmata. Next to it is the pleasure center, which applies value judgments to our behavior. And then next to that, we have the satiety control center. And immediately below this region, the hypothalamus, you can see the pituitary gland that's controlling all my hormonal behavior and the hormonal contributions to my emotional state. So it's really interesting. The satiety control is right next to the pleasure center, and both of them are right next to the circadian clock, which is going to be influencing all their activities. So just in that little bit of old brain, you've got a very tight control system, which explains why it's very difficult for people, once connections have been made between the feeding control centers and the pleasure center, it's very difficult to break those connections. And if they become obsessive, because there are a large number of connections, the only way you will break them is to develop another obsession that's not as damaging as an obsession with eating food. There we are. If we, one of the clear demonstrations of the relationship between timing and aging and nutrition is illustrated when you look at the nutritional requirements for people during age. The complete requirement of the pregnant lady to make sure that she has all the nutrients her baby needs, otherwise the baby will act parasitically and strip the nutrients out of her body. And that's particularly bad if she's short of calcium, because it will create problems for her own bones. Being a mother is the most self-sacrificial occupation in the human race. Mothers are incredible people. The fact that they will love their children unconditionally, no matter what happens, that is a stunning relationship, and it needs to be supported nutritionally. In the first 5 years of life, we never limit the supply of different types of fat and protein to a growing child, because most of its brain is going to be composed of many different types of fat. And it's a big mistake to apply a limited diet to a child up to the age of 5. As the child approaches puberty, this is when vitamin D and calcium are so important, because half the bone density of this little girl will be created during her puberty. And what I should say is half the bone density that she carries forward into menopause will be created during puberty. So it's really important to get the vitamin D and calcium into the child at puberty so that they can improve their chances of avoiding osteoporosis in later life. When it comes to the teenager, I've already mentioned that they have a nasty habit of cutting lean red meat out of their diet instead of choosing low-fat meat, which is what they should be doing. And of course, if they just cut out lean red meat, they'll dramatically reduce their chances of getting the right amounts of iron. And so there's a great danger there of them becoming anemic. When you get into the middle-aged lady, this is where the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids are particularly protective of cardiovascular disease. And when you get to the over 60s, you have a problem that it's more difficult to absorb nutrients. So here, nutrient-dense foods like lean red meat and milk become even more important because the rate at which we can absorb is dramatically reduced. Here's the honeybee brain. And if we look inside the honeybee brain, we can identify the cells that make the intellectual decisions that influence all aspects of a bee's life. These are the Kenyan cells. And if we look at one in close-up, this is an electron micrograph, and you can see the outline of the cell here. So I'll just color it in. There's the cytoplasm of the cell body. Here's the cell nucleus, which contains the honeybee genes. In the cytoplasm, we can see the mitochondrial bacteria that have been replicating every time the cell divides. It's an amazing thing to see, even in human embryo, every cell dividing and carrying the mitochondrial bacteria with it into the new daughter cells so that they will be able to produce the energy that they need to organize their atoms into the molecules that they require. I've put this slide in because you can see another object here, which is a lipofuscin granule, which I'll color up. And these appear in greater numbers and in larger sizes as the honeybee brain ages. The same granules also occur in the human brain as the human brain ages. And they're really like a dustbin where mitochondrial bacteria that are dying because they've fulfilled their purpose get broken down in this lipofuscin granule. And it's interesting to see that deterioration of brain function is often associated with the presence of these large lipofuscin bodies. Here you can see one in a 66-day-old worker bee, and you can see it's like a fingerprint of membranes that are being broken down. But in the older worker, here 216-day-old, you can see the granule is much bigger and the membranes that are being broken down are being converted into fats. So this is becoming a fat droplet. Now, if you want to live for a very long time, the best way to do it is to reduce the portions of the food in the diet without spoiling the balance. You will then extend your life expectancy, although the quality of your life may not be as enjoyable as it would if you'd eaten a little bit more food. But most mammals can extend their life expectancy if they reduce the quantity of food but still maintain the correct balance of the nutrients. And I'm going to look now just very briefly something that's absolutely up to date, which is from the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And they've been looking at senile dementia in human beings. And they've discovered that between the nerve cells in the brain, there are very, very fine nanotubules. So a nanotubule is an extremely fine tubule. And they've been able to show that large protein bodies that have been produced in a cell that's deteriorating can be transferred down the tube into a cell that was otherwise all right. And even mitochondria can be transported down these tubes. So in fact, dementia is spreading in the brain like a disease. It's not occurring because all the cells are of the same age and are equally damaged. What's happening is those that are particularly damaged have a mechanism for transferring damaging proteins from themselves to otherwise relatively healthy cells. And that's a very important discovery, and it will affect in the future how we develop new drugs for treating dementia, because an actin filament inside this tubule is responsible for conveying these proteins from one cell to another. And this actin could theoretically be inhibited so that molecules, large molecules, can't be easily transported from one cell to another. And it would be interesting to see if that could stop the spread of dementia, even though it had started in a particular brain. So for humans over 60 years, choose your parents carefully, eat a high-density micronutrient diet, have an annual blood test to make sure that what you're eating is actually getting into your bloodstream. Sadly, you have to drink alcohol sparingly the older you are, simply because alcohol is produced by yeast to kill its enemies. And it gets increasingly difficult as you get older to break the alcohol down fast enough to stop it damaging your body. Being mentally and physically active is extremely important. To have projects that motivate you, to have the societal support from family and friends. And because the mouth and the anus are very key entry points for bacteria and viruses into the body and into the blood system, it's very important to make sure that these are kept healthy. The systemic health of a person is directly proportional to their oral health. And then lastly, you have to be lucky. And for honeybees, be locally adapted. That is so important for the survival and health and well-being of honeybees. Build your colony away from other bees to reduce the transmission of disease. Live on new comb, which again reduces disease transmission with plenty of space, so the queen substance can percolate around the colony easily. Forage on a wide range of flowers, so you get a little bit of everything and not too much of any one thing. Collect honeydew and propolis from many different sources and ensure seasonal continuity of the forage. Overwinter on your own honey. This will give you your best chance. 40 pounds of honey on top of a single brood box colony in a national will certainly make a difference when it comes to winter survival, provided the queen is in good condition and the other basic factors, such as the state of the comb, are correct. But the bees themselves enjoy societal support. And many, many years ago, a scientist in France called Rémy Chauvin imprisoned bees in different cages in different numbers. So he had 5 in one, 10 in another, 50 in another, 1,000, and then 5,000. And he showed that the life expectancy of the worker bees was directly proportional to the size of the social group that they were caged with. That's how important it is for a social creature to be allowed its societal interaction. And then lastly, of course, you have to be lucky. So although I've jumped about a lot between honeybees and humans, I hope I've demonstrated that we have many of the same problems. And I hope I've also demonstrated that it's not the path that we choose in life that determines our health and our happiness. It's the way that we walk it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and I enjoyed it very much. At this point, normally there would be some applause and people talking and all sorts of things. So so I do apologize that we're not able to do all those things. There are a couple of questions, so I'll hand over to Emma to put those to you, Robert. Thank you.
Okay, the first one is from Angharad Locke, and she asks, can honeybees be malnourished if they only have one type of pollen? For example, the bees that pollinate almond trees in America.
Yes, they can. They can easily be malnourished. And it's not good for bees to be kept on one monoculture. The sad thing about almonds is, of course, in an attempt to produce a new market for the almonds that are being mass produced in California, almond milks have been created and they've been marketed as if they are in some way a suitable substitute for cow's milk. And I can tell you they're absolutely not. The almond milk actually has substances added to it, particularly vitamins and minerals, to make it look on the packet that it has the same constituents as cow's milk, but it doesn't. Cow's milk is completely different to almond milk. So you've got a real association there between honeybee nutrition and human nutrition. We need to grow less almonds. The almond itself is a perfectly good food as a nut and used as a nut in the balanced diet, but it's not a good substitute for cow's milk.
Okay. The next question from Andrew Finden. What do you recommend to suppress nosema?
This is a really big problem. Most beekeepers will know that in the past we used to use Fumidil B as a treatment for nosema, and it worked extremely well. But because it could be seen as an undesirable contaminant of honey, the government decided at a certain point that it wouldn't allow Fumidil B to be used anymore. So we have a particular problem with nosema. The first thing to do is if you recognize nosema is present, then you have to change your management processes. You have to really make sure that you're not crushing bees. You have to look at the other colonies in the apiary and see which ones don't have nosema and try and breed from those stocks. The main problem with nosema is nowadays is that there aren't really good treatments. So you have to change your manipulative techniques to minimize the spreading of the disease.
Okay, Geraint Davis said he found your talk very interesting and asks, are all honeys the same as they relate to enzymes and vitamins?
No, you get some very big differences depending on the forage that the bees have been to. It's a very interesting subject to do chemical analysis of different honeys and see what's present. If they've been to different honeydew sources, that you'll have different mixtures of nutrients present. But all honeys that contain honeydew will have a similar proportion in terms of amino acids, carbohydrates, in other words, the macronutrients. Certain vitamins like niacin and riboflavin tend to occur in most honeys.
Okay. Sorry, right. Next question is from Kate, I hope I pronounced this correctly, de Buriat. And she asks, what proportion of your bee larvae could you eat and maintain a healthy colony? That's what it says here. I'm not quite sure whether she means that.
Well, if you set up to produce bees with a view to producing powdered bees as a food supplement, if you set up your colony to do that, you will be able to produce a huge number of surplus workers and be able to take them in at a particular percentage regularly throughout the summer, and then freeze them, and then ultimately freeze dry them and powder them. I started studying bees because I was interested in the honeybee's brain and not in its honey. So I really feel that I fell in love with the honeybee for her mind rather than her body. So it would be quite hard for me to mass produce honeybee larvae with a view to killing them and powdering them and selling them as a food supplement. But it may be that the world will need to eat powdered insects in the future, because it will be so difficult to produce adequate supplies of lean red meat in the way that we do at the moment.
That's all for the questions. I just wanted to mention Sally Davis, who just says thank you for a very interesting talk as ever.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't have any questions myself. Emma, do you have any questions? Or
No, thank you.
No? Okay, and there's no more questions. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Robert for a very fascinating talk. And we hopefully will get back to meeting in a more close proximity in the future. We're hoping for that. Thank you very much. And for everybody who's attended this evening, it's been lovely to share this experience with everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.